The first reader is Carol Kammen, who wrote the wonderful preface to the book, summing up how wonderful Ithaca is for writers and anybody else who happens to live here. She's taught at TC3 and Cornell and Ithaca High School. She has many books. Her columns have been appearing in Ithaca Journal since 1978. Her most recent one was yesterday. Let me introduce you to Carol Kammen.
The Finger Lakes is as much a state of mind as it is a place. It is also much more than lakes, for there is rolling land created by glacial activity, there is a national forest, and there is the history of those who have lived and used this land, from roaming hunter-gatherers to the Iroquois Confederation, and then on to those who came to settle, demarking the land with maps, our stories piling up on each other like glacial rubble. We live on a 7-layer cake of geography and history. The Finger Lakes is bounded on the north by routes 5 and 20, from which the larger lakes, Skaneateles, Owasco, Cayuga, Seneca, and Canandaigua, hang like socks on a clothesline. The southern border of the region can be a line drawn from Ithaca to Watkins Glen, then dipping slightly down to Hammondsport, a notable Finger Lakes community, and probably while the railroads ran, one of the most popular entry points into the area. To the west, through Route 390 and Route 81 in the east, complete the encirclement. Even though geographically defined and distinctive, an inland island, perhaps, the borders are porous. Counting the Finger Lakes can be difficult. Are there 12 or 13? Or are there only 11, as the Encyclopedia of New York states? Or 17, as current tourist information likes to boast? I include tiny Cayuta, 2 miles long, La Mocha, 4 miles long, and Juaneta, also known as Green Lake, almost 7 miles in length, looking like snowflakes falling at the south. While in the west there are the Pinky Lakes, Honey Eye, Canadas, Hemlock, and Conesus, that look rather like nail clippings on the land. Altogether, the lakes appear like a toss of bent nails on a workbench. In the language of type fonts, they might be considered dingbats. Their names are variations of Iroquois words and are mostly descriptive. Long Lake, both Canadas and Skaneateles, Canandaigua from Chosen Spot, La Mocha from Mud Lake. Only Hemlock is an English word whose derivation is obscure. They are always, all of them, spoken with the word lake following the name. Cayuga Lake, Otisco Lake, Oneida Lake, unlike other bodies of water in the state, where the word lake precedes the name, Lake Champlain, Lake Ontario, and even Lake Otsego. Geographically, the Finger Lakes began as a mud sea that gradually evaporated, leaving behind a layer of salt on which an enormous glacier dumped dirt and giant boulders. A second glacier that began in the Laurentian Plain of Canada raked slowly over the land. You might think of the glaciers as a child at play, dumping rocks and dirt into a sandbox, little fingers leaving indentations on the surface, and those ditches over time eroding deeper and deeper into gorges and lakes created by glacial pressure and constantly running water. Thus was the land of the Finger Lakes created. The salt, of course, is now mined from beneath Cayuga and Seneca Lakes. Life in the Finger Lakes is not set in stone, although the rock on which we perch appears in various forms. Our local stone can be seen in the many waterfalls for which the region is famous, and in the form of lucky stones washed up on the lake shores, those smooth stones through which ancient worm-like creatures once moved, leaving behind a trail of excrement that washes away after a time in water. Fortunate are those who find lucky stones. This glacial rubble determined the quality of our soil and left moraines and drumlins that mark the land between the lakes. Another way to consider the Finger Lakes is from inside out. We can determine the center by helping to define the old. Measuring from Otisco in the east to Conesus in the west, The deep waters of Seneca are at the region's geographical center. Seneca Lake is 38 miles long. It is 618 feet to the bottom and one of the deepest lakes in North America. It is 3 miles wide at the town of Dresden. The lake's major cities are Geneva and Waterloo to the north and Watkins Glen in the south. Seneca Lake provided water transportation for goods and people, connecting via an inlet and a 23-mile canal to Cayuga Lake and to the Erie Canal. There are stories about these two middle fingers, Seneca and Cayuga. They say that the drowned in one lake may turn up in the other, but this is more myth than reality. They say, that is, the people of the Longhouse are said to have said, that the character of each lake is explained by a large serpent chopped in two by a brave lad, the flailing tail dropping into Seneca Lake, making its waters broil, the more placid but unpredictable head into Cayuga. Of course, neither lake can be totally trusted. Sailors head back to shore, so they say, when the water turns green and the wind comes from the west. They say that the drowned are rarely given up as they plunge deep into the lower frigid waters and so form a ghostly chorus below. One might think of Cayuga Lake as the center of the region because it is the lowest lake above sea level, all the others swelling up in the landscape. Cayuga's headwaters are at the south end, near Ithaca, and it drains through Montezuma Marsh and the Seneca-Cayuga Canal into the waters of Lake Ontario. It is part of the Erie Canal waterway and once was the source of north-south transportation into and out of the area. Salt rode on barges towed south on the lake. Students once rode on steamboats that brought them to the university in Ithaca. Rail cars that run along the eastern side of the lake bring coal north from Pennsylvania. And for a time, speculators at crew races could ride a short rail line on the western side of Cayuga Lake that moved along with the skulls of 4s and 6s and 8s.
Our next reader is Brad Edmondson. Brad is an independent journalist and the former editor of the Ithaca Times and Ithaca Demographics magazines. He's the author of Ice Cream Social, The Struggle for the Soul of Ben & Jerry's, and Post-War Cornell. Welcome, Brad.
One of the many great things that Carol Kammen has done for this community is the One Day in Ithaca project. About 25 years ago, she organized people to write down what they did on a certain day in Ithaca, and she did it again on May 17th, 2013. I made this essay for her for that project, never intending for it to be published anywhere, and here I am. May 17th, 2013 is a beautiful Friday in Ithaca. It begins as a cool, clear night and builds into bright sunshine, low humidity, and a high in the mid-60s. This is the time of year when the trees seem to burst. One day they're fuzzy with buds, and the next they're loaded with blossoms and fresh foliage. The young leaves are a dozen shades of green, and it's mesmerizing after a long winter to see them glistening and moving in the breeze. Looking east from my porch on Short Street, I count rows and rows of trees, from the sapling across the street to a huge sugar maple in the distance, and this time of year they're all full of singing birds. I live in downtown Ithaca, probably 100 yards from busy Route 13, but thanks to the hard-working city forester, nature here is resplendent. I'm a writer now, and this means that when I sit on my porch steps in a stained pair of sweatpants, I am actually working. That's the story I tell the IRS every year when I pay my taxes, and incredibly, they have not yet objected. When I arrived in Ithaca as a Cornell student back in 1980, Fall Creek was full of folks who had 9-to-5 jobs. Nowadays, these kinds of people are getting hard to find. Most Fall Creekers these days who hold jobs are college professors, administrators, and various flavors of professionals, or freelancers, which is the category I fall into. My paychecks come from bigger cities. I don't have many economic ties to Ithaca, but like my comfortable friends, I stay because I love it here. The privileged circles I run in are only the topmost layers of a highly stratified county. While it isn't often discussed, a lot of the economic victims of globalization and automation also live here. They're packed into crummy apartments. They're holding down 2 or 3 jobs while trying to keep their families together. And groups like the Tompkins County Workers Center lobby tirelessly for the rights of these folks. Most of us in the privileged classes, though, try to ignore them because they make us uncomfortable. Here in the city, there are about 10,000 registered voters. Almost 6,300 of them are Democrats. Another 2,200 are independent. And only about 1,000 are Republicans. So you have to work pretty hard to find someone in this town who wants to privatize Social Security or build a fence along the border with Mexico. I'm thankful that relatively few Ithacans enjoy repeating punchlines that they heard on Fox News. But I also have days here when it seems like I can't throw a stick without hitting someone who pisses me off. And this is why. Plenty of people who share my progressive political beliefs are nevertheless unwilling to work for change. They'll pay extra for organic food. They'll pay extra for fractivist coffee because it's fashionable to do that. They'll blather on and on about their beliefs. They'll whine about how bad things are. They'll tell you what you ought to do. But when you identify a need and ask them to pitch in, what you'll get from them is excuses. And these people make me crazy. My neighbors have money, skills, and connections. They could do a lot of good. But some of them say they just can't bear to try. The political realm is too corrupt and depressing for them. It's more pleasant to quietly avoid people who don't fit into their hermetically sealed worlds. These delicate flowers may never have read St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, but they're still following his advice when he says, "Come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing." Now, to my way of thinking, living apart from the world is living a diminished life. To live fully, you need to make a conscious effort to contribute to the common good. And it really doesn't matter much whether you call yourself a Christian or a Muslim, a libertarian, or a socialist. Anyone can fall into the same trap. Anyone's mind can close. And once it does, you're really just wasting everybody else's time. So writing can be a lonely job, but having an office in downtown Ithaca means that my work breaks are almost always uplifting. When I go to the post office to check my mailbox, I almost always see somebody I know. It could be the young woman with Down syndrome who leaves a law office on Tioga Street promptly at 11 o'clock every morning to go to the post office carrying her little bag and her key to do her job, which is getting the office's mail. This is a daily ritual that actually anchors both of us here, and she's usually smiling. I'm working on that. Now, on some weekdays, I exchange jokes with the guy behind the postal counter who was a volunteer disc jockey with me on Sundays at a community radio station back when we were both kids. But now my old friend is retiring, and that makes us both happy because he has time to come back to the station. On other days, I might run into the retired newspaper reporter I know who skulks around with his Nikon camera, then goes home to post his photos and his ramblings on his blog. This guy's kind of a sourpuss, but he's got soul. He cares about his community, and he's still looking for the story. Several times a week, I go to the beat-up convenience store at the corner of Seneca and Aurora Streets, and I chat with a nice young woman there who has tattoos and a nose ring. She'll sell me a Diet Coke and a bag of popcorn for $2, and then she'll smile at me, and that's worth a lot more than $2. Walking back to my office, munching on the popcorn, I might run into the bank president, who knows me because we both support the Finger Lakes Land Trust. Walking around the Ithaca Commons is like spinning the wheel of casual friendships that transcend boundaries of class, race, and politics. So whether or not they know it, the people who give Ithaca its soul are communitarians. They share a belief in cultivating social capital, which is something that the political scientist Robert Putnam describes as, quote, the collective value of all social networks and the inclinations that arise from these networks to do things for each other, unquote. Their views on political issues are important, but not as important as how they spend their time. Ithacans might be environmentalists at the land trusts, activists at the labor center. There might be small business owners at the Chamber of Commerce. They might be lonely Republicans eating breakfast at the Royal Court restaurant. Or they may just be people who open doors for each other at the post office. But when these diverse groups mix it up, amazing things can happen. May 17th, 2013 ended with a particularly nice concert at the State Theater by Hot Rise, a bluegrass band that's been a mainstay of Salt Creek, the radio show I've hosted for over 30 years. Hot Rise is based in Boulder, Colorado, and they don't tour much anymore, so tonight's concert was a big deal for bluegrass fans. It was especially sweet because their banjo player, Pete Warnick, lived in Ithaca from 1970 to 1976. And when Warnick lived in Ithaca, he formed an influential band called Country Cooking. It was one of the very first bands to inject jazz and blues sensibilities into bluegrass music. It was an early manifestation of the renaissance of American roots music that's now in full flower. The crowd for tonight's show is equal parts young hipsters wearing brand new trucker caps, rural upstaters wearing beat-up trucker caps, and a bunch of garden variety Ithaca baby boomers like me whose hair, if we still have any, is too frizzy to look good under any hat. And we're all here for one of the world's great acoustic bands, a band that came here for sentimental reasons. So from the stage, Pete Warnick gives a shout out to the guy who brought him to Ithaca, a retired Cornell professor. And I realized that I know Joe Stikos too. And then the band launches into a fast instrumental that rolls over us like breaking sunlight. I'm in the theater with people I've known for years and strangers I could easily get to know, and we're all sharing transcendence. Thanks.
Our next reader is James McConkey, who was my professor way back when I was a student at Cornell. He's an inspiration for me and for a great number of people maybe sitting in this room who took his classes. He's written a number of wonderful books of stories, essays. His last book came out from Cayuga Lake Books, A Complete Court of Memory. He is a beloved, a local fixture. Jim McConkey.
Fireflies, the essay in the anthology, appeared on a single page of the New Yorker in 1977. It is the shortest narrative based on memory that I've written. I'll read the story, a story retold to me by Gladys Jean, my wife. It constitutes the first half of Fireflies. The last half contains my response to that story based upon my experiences as a child and adolescent during the Great Depression, which, unlike the recent financial recession, brought Americans together. Anyway, my wife is editor of a professional journal for one of the colleges at the university where I teach. The people, deans, other administrative officers, secretaries who work on the floor where she has her office have a congenial and cooperative relationship and enjoy gathering occasionally during lunch hour or at the end of the working day to celebrate any of a variety of events in any of their lives: a marriage, a departure for a new job, a trip abroad, a birthday, the first day of spring after a hard winter. One afternoon early this spring, a former administrator stopped by for such a celebration. As the group was having refreshments at the large table in the conference room, this professor, a man not given to personal reminiscence, began to tell his neighbor about a bicycle trip he had taken with another student in 1936 in Germany. He was speaking quietly, but either because of a lapse in the general conversation or because of the nature of his story, everybody listened. The story was a simple one, told in a matter-of-fact voice of what he and his companions saw and did bicycling through Germany the summer following the remilitarization of the Rhineland. Perhaps in retelling his account, I am altering it in accordance with my own feelings and experience, and it is likely that the people at the party, the younger as well as the older, did much the same thing. The curious power of certain stories comes from some unconscious invitation to the listener to participate, to imagine himself an aspect of the teller. These two students, the professor-to-be and his friend, had come to Germany to see the castles on the Rhine, the Black Forest, and the picturesque towns of the travel posters, but what they actually saw had little to do with quaintness or charm. In every town, the buildings displayed swastikas on banners. Loudspeakers in every town square amplified shrill voices and martial music. The major streets were congested with parades and the movement of military personnel and equipment. On the handlebars, they had attached small American flags to identify themselves as visitors. Their bicycles, so decorated, became part of the parades, were caught in the middle of convoys. In a populous town, they sat on their bicycles in the back of a crowd, listening to Hitler give an impassioned speech and shouted words that they couldn't understand, but that turned everybody except them into what seemed a single body, a single answering voice. Once they rode through the gates, oddly open, of a camp for prisoners. Guards rushed at them with rifles, forcing them back. How do two young Americans respond to such nationalistic frenzy, to an evil they can barely comprehend? In Germany, the towns and villages nestle in the valleys, are rarely built upon the hills, as in Italy. Most castles on the Rhine have their towns far beneath them, and from the walls and windows of the towers, one can see the colored roof tiles and tiny spear spires beside the curving, glittering river. These two boys would tour, say, some castle. Then, removing the flags from their handlebars, they would hold them defiantly aloft and coast down the hill into the town, speeding through marketplaces and central squares. As they sped past the crowds and the swastika-decorated buildings, they sang together as loudly as they could the opening words of national songs of their own country. "Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain," or "Oh, say can you see, by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming," and careering around processions of armored cars and troop carriers, they shouted "Heil Roosevelt" to the soldiers, and then they pedaled furiously away up the opposite hill. Usually they stayed in a farmer's barn or camped on the heights above a town. Never that summer did anyone pursue them. Never were they molested or questioned. Never, except for that moment they had inadvertently strayed into the prison camp where they threatened. As they sat by their little cooking fire, as they stared at the stars from their sleeping bags, they spoke to each other of what they had seen, of what they had done that day. And so each day went that summer. Thank you.
The narrator in this story is 15 years old. It's a summer night, and I'm going to do an excerpt of the story, not from the beginning. It's called Gino's. We are halfway through our meal when Gino arrives. He is a bear of a man, his perfect white suit no disguise for the black hair that curls along the tops of his hands and shadows his heavy cheeks. I can imagine it bristling all over his chest against his shirt, pushing out towards the back of the tie tack that gleams with a single pearl. His shoulders are huge. The flesh of his hands is pale. Precious rings adorn 2 of his fingers. Do I say to myself, he has a dangerous face? So this is your daughter. He glances at my mother and then returns a dark gaze to me. I look away, look back. My mother is exuberant. Yes, Gino, this is my Kathy. Kathy, welcome to my home. His smile is slow and full. He has thick white teeth, one with a tiny rim of gold. I catch myself staring at it. My mother offers a nervous laugh, halfway simpering. I've told her all about the club, Gino. She can't wait to see the floor show. Is that so? Gino is suave in his reply. Well, perhaps when it's time for the show, I'll come back and sit with you. We can have a drink together. His gaze lingers on me in my white dress. What does he see? All right. My mother purrs in suppressed surprise. She is flattered, so very flattered. We'd like that. Good. Until later, then. As he speaks, I watch him with a straight child's face. Why does he look at me so? As our ice cream arrives, there is a drum roll and the lights dim. An announcer wearing a tuxedo appears in the spotlight. And now what you've all been waiting for, the girls of the Lavender Lace Review. Laughter and applause meet the musical entrance of a buxom creature with shining red hair piled fantastically above a smiling face accentuated with a large beauty mark. A blue satin gown trails along the floor. I'm Mimi, breathes a husky, sensuous voice. The crowd cheers. It's just great to see all of you folks out here tonight. With a start, I realize that Gino has taken the empty chair beside me. My mother and brother have turned their seats in order to face the dance floor. I am alone, vulnerable, forced to acknowledge him. I hope you are having a good time, Kathy, he says quietly, bending towards me. He wears a crimson flower in one buttonhole. I smile wanly at him, suddenly self-conscious about the dessert melting before me. It's very nice here, I lie and take a sip of water. I'm glad you like it, he says, and leans back in his chair as though he has scored a minor triumph. The redhead on the dance floor continues to speak to the audience, moving into a stand-up comic routine that culminates in pulling the stuffing out of the front of the satin gown and using it to wipe off the top of the piano. The crowd howls and claps. My mother, enjoying herself immensely, turns to see how I am liking the show and sees Gino sitting next to me. She smiles more widely than before. My brother continues to watch the performance as if mesmerized. My mother takes out a cigarette, and quickly Gino leans across the table to light it for her. When he resettles in his chair, he is several inches closer to me. I feel the heat of him. I wonder why he is moving towards me. I wonder why his smile flashes in the dimness, why his eyes study my face and body. I am 15. I look 12. I have a glass of milk and a dish of ice cream in front of me. My mother and brother sit 3 feet away. I wear no makeup. There is a charm bracelet on my wrist. I still read fairy tales. My shoes are from 8th grade graduation. I've kissed only 2 boys, one of them only once. He is 45 years old. What does he want? Yet I know, he knows, I've thought about his hair. He knows, I know my mother likes to drink in his club, be important there, share her table with the owner. But surely he won't dare touch me. Why would he touch me? He has a dangerous face. Yes, I say it now to myself. I am no beauty, but he is a beast. Oh, my mother with rose-red lips. Oh, my mother who wants me to love her. She watches the wooden floor, where now a coin-clad belly dancer with long raven tresses gyrates and shakes as patrons stuff bills into the golden girdle encircling slender hips. Finale. The dancer whirls, casts away the gleaming veil, seductively unfastens the front clasp of the jangling bra as the music grinds and climbs to an ecstasy of melody, and oh, there is nothing there but a flat male chest, carefully shaved, proudly revealed to the titillated crowd who explodes with delight and admiration. Gino chuckles beside me, watching me, my consternation. His hand almost ready, I almost realize, to reach carefully for my smooth white dress.
Mingfo Ho is a longtime Ithaca resident. She has published a number of books for young adults and children. The part that she's put in a book is from her experience working with refugees on the Cambodian border. She's written a wonderful story, which is in the anthology, Mingfo Ho.
So the story that I'm reading from that's in this book is called The Winter Hibiscus, and it takes place in Ithaca. It's about a Laotian girl who's about 16 years old and who has just taken and failed her first driving test in Ithaca. She's walking home after she has taken the test, and she sees a bush that's sort of familiar to her. She plucks a leaf from it, and she's trying to identify it, but cannot. So she goes into a florist's shop and asks the florist what this leaf is from that bush. And the florist leads her to the back where there's a greenhouse. It was late, and Sang, who's the girl, was starting to get hungry. Still, she followed the other woman, the florist, through the greenhouse door and walked in. Sang gasped. It was like walking into another world, a hot, moist world exploding with greenery. Huge flat leaves, delicate wisps of tendrils, ferns and fronds and vines of all shades and shapes grew in random profusion. Over there in the corner, the hibiscus, is that what you mean? The florist pointed at a leafy, potted plant by the corner. There in the shaft of the wan afternoon sunlight was a single blood-red blossom, its 5 petals splayed back to reveal a long stamen tipped with yellow pollen. Sang felt a shock of recognition so intense it was almost visceral. "Sabah," she whispered. A sabah hedge, tall and lush, had surrounded their garden at home in Laos, in its green leaves dotted with vermilion flowers. And sometimes after a monsoon rain, a blossom or two would float into the well, so that when she drew up the well water, she would find a red blossom in the bucket. Slowly, Sang walked down the narrow aisle of the greenhouse towards the hibiscus. Orchids, lana bushes, oleanders, elephant ear begonias, bougainvillea vines surrounded her. Plants that she had not even realized she had known and forgotten drew her back into her childhood world. When she got to the hibiscus, she reached out and touched a petal gently. It felt smooth and cool with a hint of velvet toward the center, just as she had known it would feel. She scanned the greenery around her and found a tall, gangly plant with little white blossoms around it. "Doc Malik," she said, savoring the feel of the word on her tongue, even as she silently noted the English name on its tag, Jasmine. One of the blossoms had fallen off, and carefully Sang picked it up and smelled it. The familiar fragrance filled her, and she could almost feel the light strands of her grandmother's long gray hair freshly washed as she combed it with a buffalo horn comb. And when the sun had dried it, Sang would help the gnarled old fingers knot the hair into a bun and then slip a single Doc Malik blossom into it. Sang looked at the white bud in her hand now, small and fragile. She closed the palm around it and held it tight. That at least she could hold on to. But where was the comb, the hibiscus hedge, the well, her grandmother? A wave of loss so deep and strong that it stung Sang's eyes now swept over her. A blink, a channel switch, a boat ride in the night, and it was all gone. Irretrievably, irrevocably gone. Thank you.
Our next reader is Fred Wilcox. Fred started out as a poet, lost the muse, and spent many years writing nonfiction. He's now recovering from all that by writing fiction. Chasing Shadows is a creative nonfiction account of the years he spent living on the streets of New York City's Lower East Side. Welcome, Fred.
This is from Chasing Shadows, and it's a memoir. The last time I saw Zorro, he called New York a bummer, said the Lower East Side was a down place for hobbits, and declared Middle Earth defunct. "Bilbo's dead, man," said Zorro, pacing in front of the bench on which I was sitting. "And poor little Frodo, too. Oh, the tiny people done split for the hate, man. Warmer there, more peaceful, better vibes altogether. This just ain't where it's at anymore. Too much freakiness, nothing shaking at all. I loves Groovy, man. He was like my soul, my own soul. Beautiful cat. And they wasted him. Linda too, man. Cat just took a brick and smashed in their heads, man. Didn't know how much love he was killing. Didn't care, I guess. I know they're happy in the next Sharka, but I'm feeling down, way, way down. Time for Zorro to split, man. Take old baby snake and hit the road. Everything is karma. You know that, the dance of God. Who am I to try to direct? I follow, man. And when the currents pick me up, I float. Wow, like one huge, everlasting trip coming till my brain drains. But listen here, man. Here's my latest poem. Later for the dames, flying home on cranes, hugging unicorn manes, sucking on the flames. Facto man, Frado will rise from the dead, raise up his head, give us more bread. Handing back the ring, so we can all do our thing, going with the flow, naked in the snow. I go with the karmic flow. Well, goodbye, Zorro, I said, shaking his hand. I'll probably still be here when you get back. Not coming back, bro. Gonna hang in the sun, have some fun. I'll miss seeing you around here, I said. You're so bad, Zorro laughed. Never could quite get your case down. You and Julie Trees, man, strange cats. Like hipsters, man, like Lady and Master Hard Rock. But cool, very cool. I dig your vibes, man. Always dug them. Knew you were good for a handout anytime. Anytime you weren't looking for one yourself. I sat in Tompkins Square Park, drifting in and out of the past, unable to project a future, watching kids who came to the city for a happy hit and got one. Arms measled with needle tracks, skin like old newsprint, eyes locked permanently on vacant. Watching the parade, seeing my own reflection, and wondering if we would be forgotten. Would the city of New York erect a statue in Tompkins Square Park to the unknown flower child? Kids like Groovy and Linda, who thought their own good vibes would deliver them from evil and wound up getting clubbed to death by a junkie in a basement on Avenue B. Would famous speed freaks like Julie Trees and acid heads like Zorro have their handprints in the park's sidewalks? And might future generations find a bronze plaque stating that on October 4th, 1958, Archibald J. Hendricks, the very first beatnik to arrive on the Lower East Side, sat on this bench and smoked a joint. Watching my own reflection pass by, I felt a strange new passion to stay alive. I wanted to swim out of the undertow of romantic suffering that had pulled and was still suffering, pulling so many of us under. We'd made a cult out of death, turning Hart Crane, Sylvia Plath, Dylan Thomas, and others into idols. We wanted to balance on the razor's edge, to look clearly and fearlessly into the abyss, to die young and misunderstood. If our lives were generally tragic, they would make sense. If we suffered enough, we would be remembered. But I had danced too many times with death, slipping away just before the music ended, the escape beating through my veins like a hot shot of speed. I was tired of participating in my own demise. It just didn't make sense anymore. If we had run away from families who put us in jail and locked us up in snake beds back in Ohio and California and Iowa, then why were we killing ourselves in the Big Apple? Someday, Dr. Maynard had said, you will want to see those great lightning flashes out of the plains again. You'll want to take a clump of that black earth in your hands and roll it around, feeling the magic of it, the strength, the difference between it and concrete. That's when the pain will come, Dr. Maynard continued. Not when you're out there trying to survive, living on anger, hating, but one day when you wake up and look out the window like I did years ago and wish you could smell spring again, wishing you could walk beside a stream and watch little patches of ice start to break up and flow away. And there's winter wheat poking up through the snow, a family of crows eating corn, the sky so blue you suffer a kind of panic. I sat in Tompkins Square Park, and late one night a group of Puerto Rican kids came prancing and laughing and owning the world, and I stood with my back against the wall, silently warning them not to get too close to me, not to look at me, not to F with me. And above this paranoid rumbling, a little voice clear as kindness telling me that fear had driven me mad, urging me to leave before I injured or even killed someone. I drove a screwdriver deep into the heart of my rat's nest mattress, nailed the windows shut, installed a new set of locks on the doors, and flushed the keys down the toilet. Then I threw all of my belongings into a paper bag, bought a one-way ticket to a town in Pennsylvania, and left the old demon friends a note. Dear nice boys, I hope you all wind up in the East River with many large holes in your nice heads.
Gary Cox is going to read next. Gerald Cox has been an administrator at Cornell, an English professor in Washington, and he's the author of a book called Blood on My Hands, which he talks about hunting and fishing and the great outdoors. Here's Gary Cox.
Bird shooting was a long-standing tradition in my family, beginning with my grandfather, continuing through my father. He was fortunate, married someone who loved bird shooting even more than I think he did, and they brought me up to do the same thing. At that point, early on, we lived in New Canaan, Connecticut. We did some minimal pheasant hunting around there, but then we moved to Seattle, where the bird shooting was considerably better. We used to hunt pheasants as a side, where Microsoft is right now. And my parents and I continued to go bird shooting. But then I went into the Navy, to graduate school at Stanford, came to teach at the University of Washington. But by that time, my parents had started taking 6 weeks or so in the fall and going up to Alberta to really do some bird shooting. So we rarely went bird shooting together. One year, however, our schedules coincided, and we were able to plan a trip to open the pheasant season on a wheat ranch owned by a friend of mine in Walla Walla. We had good shooting that first afternoon. As we walked back to our car in those long rays of light that burnished the wheat stubble to gold, I felt obscurely ill at ease. I realized that I'd been watching my father the same way he had watched me when I first began to carry a gun. We had somehow exchanged roles. He had become a younger me, and I had become him. The next day was notable for a number of odd incidents. The first involved our plans to hunt a hillside of wild roses. I told my father to stay at the bottom of the hill while my mother and I went to the top. We then let our 2 dogs loose and hunt parallel to each other. From previous years there, I knew the birds would be near the top and that they would fly down the slope toward my father. My father nodded his agreements to my tactic and went to a spot as my mother and I laboriously climbed up the furrows in the back of the hill. When we came into position, however, we were astonished to see my father wandering off by himself, going in a completely different direction than the one he'd agreed to. We shouted, blew our whistles, finally even fired some shots to attract his attention, but Dad remained oblivious. Fortunately, he was headed towards the car, where after we hunted the top and watched a number of cock pheasants take off downhill exactly as anticipated, we found him waiting impatiently for us. When I asked him with some irritation why on earth he'd gone off on his own, he didn't seem to know what I was talking about. That was odd. But what happened next was even more so. Their Brittany Spaniel, Cy, pointed in fairly heavy cover. Dad walked in, and out flew 5 or 6 birds that looked like immature hen pheasants, which, as most of you probably know, are illegal to shoot. You can only shoot cock pheasants. My mother and I yelled, "Hen! Hen!" at the top of our lungs, but my father shot anyway. To our consternation, he killed it. As we walked over to him, Cy retrieved it. Much to our surprise, it was not an illegal hen pheasant, but a legal chucker partridge. What was odd, that my father had no idea what species of bird it was, and he'd shot chuckers and Hungarian partridges, and quail, Bob White's, and on and on and on and on in his lifetime. He had no idea what this bird was. I had to identify it for him, but he was delighted with it. He kept it next to him when we had a picnic lunch and kept stroking it and saying, "Isn't it beautiful?" Well, they are beautiful, but this wasn't like my father at all. To make matters worse, near the end of that afternoon, my father inexplicably began to shoot at every hen pheasant that flushed. My mother and I would scream, "Hen! Hen!" as loud as we could, yet my father would blaze away. Each of these incidents surprised us because it was so out of character. It was peculiarly shocking for my father to do this, and it may have been this element of shock that prevented my mother and me from realizing what was going on. Each time, one of us would go over to him, explain that it was illegal to shoot hen pheasants. Dad would say he understood, and then he'd do it all over again. It began to be farcical. And of course, the farce intensified with each repetition. The dogs would point, a hen would get up, we would shout, and he would shoot. He missed every one, fortunately, and after we hiked back down the draw we'd been hunting, we quit for the day. At the beginning of our last day, my father suddenly announced he didn't want to hunt anymore. He was fed up, and he wanted to leave immediately for home. I didn't want to do this. I'd taken a day off from teaching, and I was there. My mother didn't want to go home. We finally compromised we'd hunt that morning. He could wait for us in the car, and then we'd go home and not hunt that afternoon. We had a picnic lunch and then began the long drive back to Seattle. I had forgotten how many pheasants we did shoot that opening weekend, recalling only that my father had fortunately missed all his hen pheasants. But recently I came across a photograph that my mother took just before we started home. My father and I are sitting side by side on the tailgate, each holding a cock pheasant. A row of other pheasants is laid out beside us. Cy is nuzzling me for a pat, and in the background, my setter Val is sound asleep. I'm frowning into the sun, while my father looks slightly puzzled, as if again he were not quite sure what was going on. That's how I see the picture now, at least. For subsequent events made my father's behavior that weekend not odd, but symptomatic. His absent-mindedness about hunting that hillside, his childlike pleasure in his chucker, his shooting at illegal hens, and even his insistence that he go home despite our desire to continue hunting, were all consistent with the initial stage of senile dementia. Dementia comes from the Latin, undoing of the mind, and senile dementia, as my mother, my sister, and I were to learn, involves the progressive and irreversible loss of mental functions. And that was what happened to my father, at first gradually. He merely seemed more absent-minded than usual, more irritable, more insistent on doing exactly what he wanted to do when he wanted to do it, and then ever more rapidly. The summer after our hunting trip, I left Seattle for Ithaca, so my parents moved to California to be near my sister. As my mother nursed my father, first his memory, then his mind, and finally his body failed. He died in his sleep less than 2 years later. In a real sense, then, my father had begun to die that opening weekend. Until we hunted together, I'd given little thought to the eventuality of my father's death, or, by extension, to the eventual coming of my own. I knew, of course, that my father couldn't live forever. But until we went pheasant hunting on that trip, this knowledge had remained a distant abstraction, the kind of knowledge that's only theoretical, as in the syllogism, man is mortal, my father is a man, therefore my father is mortal. After our trip, however, I began to experience the pain concealed in that logic. As I recalled those shadows lengthening over the wheat stubble, I realized that my father, was going to die. It'd be just a matter of time before he himself became a shadow, a memory surviving only in the minds of those who had loved him. And I felt then that prickling that signals the coming of tears. I'm not sure which of us I cried for. Now, more than 30 years later, I rather suspect that I cried for myself, for the son that would have to be all father from then on. Our last hunt together, therefore, turned out to be something altogether different from what I had expected. I was looking for easy symmetries, I suppose, but there were too many internal differences. At this writing, I'm as old as my father was on that trip, and my son is the age I was then. My son isn't interested in bird shooting, unfortunately, so he'd have no use for my grandfather's shotgun that my father shot after his father died, and that I shoot after my father, because my father died and came to me. But perhaps selfishly, I hope my son will remember something distinctive the two of us did experience together, something that will remain clear despite the passing of time. On that last hunt together with my father, I can still recall that certain slant of light as the sun dropped close to the stubble fields. As we walked back to the car late that first afternoon, we could see our shadows lengthening before us, son and father, father and son.
For too many students, schools are like factories, large institutions where they are inspected, tested, and rated until they are passed on to other schools or employers where they are further tested and rated. But for students from the Lehman Alternative Community School, a 6 to 12 public alternative in Ithaca, New York, school is a place where dreams are born, where the education of the capacity for imagination, for feeling that life is alive with possibilities, has a place along with the ability to think critically. A graduate of LACS named John Lewis inspired this insight. When still a student, he created a mural of Peter Pan characters whose faces were those of staff and students from the school, youthful dreamers dreaming. In July 2014, LACS had its 40th anniversary celebration reunion. I went to the reunion thinking about all the dreams that students had had for their lives, and wondering how many saw their dreams realized, felt happy, how many would remember the school and me fondly, and feel that we had prepared them well for the world. As soon as I opened the door to the beautiful guest house where the reunion event was held, I had my answer. But first, think about dreams. There are so many ways we use the word dream, some positive, some negative. Start with night dreams. They arise when we are most vulnerable, out of a mystery, or they often feel like a mystery. They can feel like an expression of what is most intimate to us, unknown not only to others, but also to our own conscious awareness. Many of us remember few dreams. We live our lives surrounded by a largely unknown territory of our own making. Then there are daydreams. By daydreams, we can mean those moments when we drift from the reality of now into flights of fantasy, or we can mean imaginatively exploring possible courses of action. We can use the mind like a chalkboard, or play movies of our own creation in order to explore scenarios of what might be. We set our mind free. How well you use your capacity to dream depends on how aware you are of your own mental processes. After a night dream, you might think of yourself as the hero or heroine, but that can be deceiving. You perceive each scene in a dream from either the perspective of a character in the dream who looks like you, or from a godlike perspective looking down on it. You can take this person who looks like you for the self, but this is a mistake. Each dream image is ambiguous in several ways, but one way is that each element of the dream is you. You are not just a central character, but the whole scene. When you have a nightmare of being overwhelmed by a flood or a wave, you are not just a being overwhelmed, but the force of overwhelming. When you are hugged by the love of your life, you are hugged by yourself. And this gets us back to the reunion, which included an ASM, an all-school meeting, as part of a symposium on education. At LACS, once a week, the whole school meets to discuss some issue or proposal or share an event together. This was a poignant blast from the past for many graduates. Dr. Dave Lehman, the founding father of the school and principal, a first principal, brought a proposal to the group. In this school handbook, our mission is defined as creating global citizens, persons of character who strive to be caring, kind, trustworthy, recognizing where there is bias and such. Dr. Dave proposed that we add the word compassionate. He quoted the Dalai Lama defining compassion as concern, affection, and warm-heartedness. The essence of compassion, he said, is a desire to relieve the suffering of others. The motion passed overwhelmingly. In her introduction to the ASM, Diane Carruthers, the present-day principal, quoted educator and activist Septima Clark as saying that education is freedom. I'd add, to go along with Dr. Dave, that the recognition of interdependence is freedom. Compassion is freedom. We are too often miseducated into thinking that our welfare is opposed to that of others, and so we often feel torn, bound, and isolated. Like in a dream, recognizing that the whole dream situation and all the characters in it are you is liberating. Compassion is liberating as it wakes us up to how important other people and relationships are to us. And this is what the reunion showed me. Leaving the school was an opportunity for graduates to learn the meaning of their dreams. We are always embedded with others in a world, like a dream character is embedded in the dream. Students said that what LACS did for them was give them the freedom to be themselves, to trust, and thus discover who they were and to speak from that process of discovery. It did the same for me and for other staff members. We knew we were doing something meaningful. We trusted with some careful watchfulness. We tried our best to nurture others, and in turn, we were nurtured. What we gave, we received. I never felt so accepted by a large group as I felt at the reunion. I came to the reunion hoping to hear that every student was a success. But students made clear to me that I had an outdated notion of success. Success is not about worldly recognition. The mark of a successful life is how we live it, how much we feel we play an important role in other people's lives and they play a role in ours. We illustrate the mirroring quality of compassion. How we live with ourselves is mirrored by how we live with others. We are all, as environmental activist John Perkins said, dreaming the world together.